Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the Brands Under Duress webinar. For those of you that weren't able to make the session at PRSA Icon event last week, we're excited to share some of the data that we shared during that event. My name is Tara Naughton, and I am a leader at on the intelligence team within Storyful, and my colleague Kieran Bossum is also here as part of the intelligence team. So thank you again for taking the time to join us. As you may be or may not be aware, Storyful is an intelligence company. We're part of News Corp, so we sit alongside different business units like Wall Street Journal, Dow Jones, um, uh, New York Post, different media companies. And our role within the network is to provide intelligence to brands. So just to level set what you're about to see here, we provide social data insight and intelligence to brands, to media partners, and to communications agency partners. What we focus on is helping people understand the signals within social media so that they can have a better understanding and better insight for their communications planning. That includes risk and reputation. It includes the ability to benchmark how a brand is performing against strategic initiatives or messaging that's important to the brand. And it also includes giving an understanding of competitive intelligence. And that helps understand what's breaking through from the people that you're sitting alongside in a specific category for, and also where there are white space opportunities and risks that might be worth taking a look at. The focus of today's webinar is really to talk about the positive impact social data can have on your communications planning. And the best way to get that understanding, we feel, is to be able to get as much of a handle on the volume and velocity of voices that are happening on a daily basis that are causing brands to be sometimes pulled into conversations that they maybe didn't plan. So for us, the best way to show the benefit of social data is to do it through a case study. And the case study that we're sharing today is a case probably many of you are familiar with, and that is the shift that Cracker Barrel recently made as it evolved their brand and modernized their stores. I want to say from the outset, this is not in any way work that we did for Cracker Barrel directly. This is public data, and this is a data story around what we saw in the months leading up and the during and the after effect of the changes that the brand made. And we use that to give you context for how social data can help impact in a positive way the decision making that is afforded to you. So we're going to take you through this story, and we make absolutely no judgments on Cracker Barrel's decision making. We are only looking at it from a social data perspective, and they obviously were armed with a lot more intelligence in their decision making. So this is just a look from a social data perspective about the change, the impact, and the narrative themes that emerged. From the outset, when we looked at social data in the lead up to before they made a decision to change their brand and logo representation to the actual crisis that emerged as a result of that decision, we saw a massive flip. We looked at social sentiment in the lead up to the change. And what you see here is that there was 45% positive, getting up to 80+% on neutral in relation to how people felt about the brand, and very little negative. And negative could be accounted for. People just aren't a fan of the restaurant or the food. Nothing out of the ordinary here in the run up. But when you look at sentiment and how the conversation shifted during the brand change, you see a massive flip. You see the number of mentions skyrocket, over 280,000 mentions on platforms like X. You see an increase in volume to the tune of over 12,000%. And you see an increase in mentions of specifically of their senior leadership. So this is just a taste of the data that we're going to take you through to give you context on what happened. So pre-logo, very positive, neutral sentiment about the brand. During the crisis, a major shift in how people perceive the brand. And now we're going to dig into some of the data around the conversations in the 9 months prior that hopefully give you context. And Kieran's going to walk through the tool so that you can see the data and understand what you're seeing on screen. So I'll turn it over to Kieran.
Thanks, Tara. Yeah, this object on the right is an output, a data visualization, if you will, of more than 85,000 posts from which our analysts then pulled and culled 15,000 of the most engaged to create a narrative flow and a mapping. If we go and look closely at how our analysts applied their human in the loop capabilities to that data set, we started to see again, from that time period of the beginning of the year through basically the start of summer, um, where the narrative discourse around Cracker Barrel as a brand was maturing and taking shape. And if you look here, you see represented conversations from Reddit, X, from online news sources and blogs, forums, Instagram, Blue Sky, Facebook, and other, just to sort of identify for us and for you these discrete themes and discourse across these digital and social media channels that for the average brand planner or communications expert would not perhaps have signaled risk to anybody and perhaps wouldn't even have surfaced with an off-the-shelf SaaS listening tool if you did a standard sentiment analysis or thematic search query if you were in the middle of a brand change. But again, as Cracker Barrel began its brand relaunch and the company had started to commence reopening newly redesigned restaurants and served up refreshed menus and had activated its PR engine to deliver some really strong media coverage around these changes, the most prevalent indicators of a sort of brand engagement didn't really strike as red flags to Cracker Barrel or to its leadership. So the sort of the tenor of this discussion is what to us as an organization represents risk within these numbers, within this discourse, and what implications can we or you, the audience, take away from the references to brand change that are here during the course of the early stage of their brand transformation, and how do we look at values, culture and values, topics of nostalgia, memeable Americana, taken collectively with the evolution of the brand as a point of disappointment. If you look at the top number, we're going to dig into that and just see how these things taken collectively create a risk map that perhaps going forward brands need to think twice about. One of the core areas of engagement, this 10% of the total engagement pool that we showed in the previous map, described Cracker Barrel as memeable Americana. And the idea of this meme here represents a brand perception of an organization, of a restaurant that is really in sort of a stable form of the Americana aesthetic and really represents this positive engagement from more than 10% of those collective narratives of those engaged customers and those who were interested in the brand, that felt that the brand itself had kind of transcended its role as a fast casual restaurant brand and really had become enshrined in this cultural zeitgeist. So really it's a shorthand that people use when gently joking about or softly critiquing the brand. And here, if we dig in to look at some of the narrative themes that were percolating, we hear topics such as affectionate parody or symbolic shorthand or emblematic of cultural identity. And this can mean a comfort with or a sense of nostalgia over an outdated, perhaps, or an old-fashioned set of values, depending on the person applying the meme. But again, these are sort of anchor sentiments that play a big role in defining how strongly and solidified that brand is in the collective consciousness of the American populace. And if you look at the largest core subset of themes within that engaged 15,000 of the 85,000, you start to see these ideas sort of taking a greater shape. The idea that there's a never changing nature of Cracker Barrel, or evocative of a forgotten childhood, or a true reference point for Americana. These are really signal points to anybody who's leading a brand that your brand is, developing a heritage and has some anchoring attributes that, if changed and altered in any way, could shake the apple cart of these common perceptions of where Cracker Barrel sits in this sort of normalized state of what American heritage, Americana, what these memeable functions are for people's hearts and minds. Looking very closely at that 1% that I showed in the earlier slide, again, the idea here is that 1% didn't mean a whole lot. And we heard from the CEO in news at this time that pushback on the brand's modernization themes and schemes really weren't representing a ripple effect or really risk, in the sense that they felt that their core customers who were experiencing the restaurants firsthand mattered more perhaps than to those they perceived to be criticizing or pushing back against the evolution of the brand. So the 1% number, to perhaps taken on its own in a vacuum, didn't recognize or didn't represent significant risk. Again, the context of culture, of Americana, of heritage values and belief systems probably weren't thought of or weren't looked at in this context. So risk was not raised. In this slide, we're starting to show you a beta version of a risk mapping tool that we are developing right now. And the idea of this matrix is that it takes overall narrative risk scores from 7 standardized drivers across all the narratives to calculate a near real-time semblance of what risk is occurring across digital and social networks, and how brands might apply this new risk matrix to know when and how to escalate risk mitigation efforts when they're either undergoing a brand transformation or they're in the midst of a narrative that they don't necessarily control and their brand is becoming part of the dialogue.
So what we have next is the actual brand change. On August 19th, the logo change was announced. And at that time, there was a very, very significant reaction. And we're going to get into a little bit of the data related to that. But as you can see, the smaller original logo you see on the left shifted, maintaining the color palette, maintaining a lot of the visual characteristic, but removing some of the symbolism and the tagline. Before we get into the data around what happened as a result, we wanted to just make note of something. If you're going through a change that's material to the brand, there's a lot of past history that you can draw on, that you can look at past brand experiences. So we want to make sure people look at the fact that other major brands, not small brands, major brands like Sports Illustrated, Disney, Harley Davidson, Dunkin' Donuts, all had a backlash to a change that they made based on being wrapped up or drawn into a conversation around the quote unquote going woke. So if you're Cracker Barrel and you have a conversation around your brand that focuses on nostalgia and cultural mainstay, one of the things in hindsight to look at might have been past brand experiences of changes that were made. Some of these changes wouldn't necessarily cause you to think there would be concern. A casting decision around Snow White, a choice of which social platform to advertise on for Dunkin' Donuts. These weren't major changes and shifts, but they resulted in a lot of conversation spike. And just for context, too, not shown here, but to be aware of, we looked at data over the course of a 2 year period, and there were 400,000 plus mentions of brands, quote unquote, going woke. So that should give you an understanding of just how significant conversation is around brands in any step that they take, and that you can't always be in control of the meaning that people assign to the change that you're making. Just quickly, these are case studies you're probably very familiar with, but Balenciaga made a choice to use children in an ad surrounding what some felt very inappropriate objects. They face calls for boycotts. Their brand has dropped in positive sentiment on major fashion platforms. Bud Light made choices around diverse set of influencers for its campaign, faced major backlash and loss of revenue. Tesla, particularly in the European market, when their senior leadership got involved in politics in the U.S., saw a massive drop in revenue and stock in the European market. So these changes have material impacts, which is why we think it's so important to have as much data as possible before you make a change. Now, getting back to Cracker Barrel, when the change was made in August, what we saw was a rise in sharing. And what you're looking at here is something that we call Cosmos. It's our ability to map specific accounts and how they are sharing content and which audiences they are influencing. So red nodes are originated content, blue nodes are the blue dots you see are those that are sharing and resharing content from those accounts. And what was interesting to see here is while there was local media coverage and local posts from smaller individuals online, when the New York Post posted about the logo change, it saw over 78,000 engagements immediately. As a result of that post, it started to spread more rapidly. So what you see here is a combination of social conversation driving digital news coverage, driving more social conversation. So for context, you need to have your eye on both how social accounts are driving narratives and also how media is playing in and factoring in. So this was a massive amount of conversation that shifted the decision making at Cracker Barrel for a brand, and they decided to make a change back. So very quickly, we saw that pressure drive the brand to reverse the logo changes and to really shift from the messaging around modernization to return to their values, to return to their DNA and heritage as a brand. So that's where we landed after seeing that broad amount of social and digital news coverage. The brand felt such a level of pressure that they felt they had to revert back, and that happened shortly after we saw this backlash take place. So learning is get as much data as possible in advance, and also have an idea of the velocity of conversation that's happening around your brand in real time, especially when you already had signals in advance. Karen's going to talk a little bit about what happened from cultural mainstay and nostalgia to post logo change, how the conversation around the brand changed. So I'll turn to Karen.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. Yeah, so post logo change, you can see from the data that the narrative has shifted dramatically. And if you were a brand steward or someone sitting in comms or risk or PR, you'd be understanding now just how far afield the narrative around your brand has moved and shifted out of your hands and into the hands of a public, increasingly associating your brand change with political themes and topics that really are incendiary and create a whole new layer of risk. And we, again, looking here between late summer and October data sets, by the time of the announcement of the brand rollback, the conversation has gone into a whole new realm. Now, if you are running risk or if you're running crisis communications, what you see in this data are opportunities to guide recovery, as well as to identify surface new risk and opportunity. But how then do you engage? With whom do you engage? On which channels? And then how do you create a counter narrative or narrative that is based on the themes that are going to be most resonant to the audiences that you're trying to assuage or win back to brand loyalty? And that's really where we come in. That's where our human-led analysis and crisis mitigation efforts pay off for our clients who are undergoing similar sorts of circumstances. If we look at just one of the subsets there, which really focuses just on the logo reversal conversation, you can see there that you've got an expanded narrative, right? The conversation has moved away from memeable Americana and themes of anchored heritage American values into areas that are so politicized that they're reaching into areas of corporate governance and HR that go well beyond what a typical brand communications specialist or expert or even CMO has a ledger domain over. So this is a really broad area of opportunity and learning for any organization now that thinks about a brand change, and just the implications for a market that has created something of a minefield for shifting the equities away from what your brand represents today, and understanding just the nature of modernization or change as being a hot button item for any organization that thinks about trying to upscale or uplift its sales and service for customers who they are trying to reach today, and don't realize just how important those customers who are listening represent for your brand's health. It is a slow climb back for Cracker Barrel. They continue to be in the news. As recently as last week, our sister company, the Wall Street Journal, has been covering some of the challenges that the CMO and CEO have been facing since the backlash for the logo change, but also just generally around the modernization efforts that they've made around their brand and their company. And you can see here the flip side of the slide that Tara had showed earlier, where sentiment is still very negative many months out from the first signs of a backlash. Interestingly enough, if you look at that big red blotch of negative sentiment there under the post logo change, 41%, it's may not be correlated directly, but it almost matches dollar for dollar the percentage drop in their share price over the last 3 months. So really interesting to see that sentiment also, negative sentiment also has a direct and very severe impact on the profitability and earnings capability of this brand, which is now trailing many of its competitors in the space who, over the same period of time may have had a slight decline, 5, 10, 12%, but 41, 42% drop in share price is notable. The conversation, I guess one could say about Cracker Barrel is not as high volume as it was. So the volume of engaged posts who are expressing anger and outrage have gone down. So Cracker Barrel really is sort of not necessarily the center point of conversation, but the company's decision to change definitely keeps it in the center point. So meaning it is still in a crisis frame. It's perhaps entering what we call the reputational residue phase. People are still talking about it, and a lot of top influencers have tied political or ideological identity to it, which means the sentiment is fairly entrenched. And the casual public and the regional news headlines might have sort of moved on, but this is still coverage that motivates critics like the ones seen here, Robbie Starbuck, people who help shape public perception, remain engaged and watching carefully. So any kind of change that the Cracker Barrel leadership is now contemplating needs to be tabled for the time being, because they are still a touchstone and still representative of a sentiment that could be very quickly triggered again. Cracker Barrel did a great job of shifting back, showing that they were listening to those who were detracting from their viewpoint of change, bringing their logo back, trying to set the right tone. But the crisis is long from over. Again, leaders who are leaning into the challenge and are addressing this through traditional press, as the CMO did with the Wall Street Journal interview, is perhaps the right way to start repairing reputation. But so too is it that they need to be thinking about the data found in engagement and shared voices and opinions that may be in orbit one step removed from their brand, to understand when it's safe to start advertising and marketing and promoting their products and their brand, under a new context, and finding their way back to health, which could be a long road for companies like Cracker Barrel, who might have missed some of the key signals resident in the ecosystem that we cover on a daily basis. So back to Tara with some great lessons.
Yeah, we just want to summarize a few takeaways that we had in looking at the data. First, that brand risk extends beyond what you may have on your plate as key stakeholders and key issues. It involves culture, it involves politics, it involves social and financial battlegrounds. So whenever you're making a change, you need to think about the greater context that your brand sits in and have that inform your decision making. Second, and this is a real lesson, I think, for Cracker Barrel in particular, but really any brand values and mission must be the underpinning of all your decisions. And we say that because when you look at even Cracker Barrel's mission and values that they have online, there's really some solid guidance for who the brand is and how the brand shows up. So I think it's not to say that the brand changes couldn't have happened. It's that the storytelling around the brand changes should have evoked a little bit more of the DNA of the brand, the mission and values of the brand. And I think that might have impacted how they were received more broadly. Also, customer informed transformation should be customer led. When you're changing elements that are at the touch closest to the customer, you want to make sure that they are part of the leading voices for your storytelling. Therefore, you are actually making a change with your customers rather on your customers, which is the way I think it felt based on some of the social commentary that we saw online. The other thing is just that any brand choice could trigger a significant loss of brand equity and market share. That's never been more true than it is today. And if you ask some of the brands, even the broader brands, about a choice not to advertise or promote content on a specific social platform, like Duncan encountered, or the choice of who you cast in a movie role that Disney encountered, you wouldn't have thought of them as being really controversial decisions. But the reality is, there's a lot of conversation happening around brands that is out of their control. So, arming yourself with as much intelligence as possible is really important. And the last lesson is just timely context and action is everything. Sometimes the decision is not to act, but you need at least the context for conversation going on to make those decisions. And sometimes the decision is to act, and you have to weigh that against your brand values and mission. So, those are just some quick takeaways from the social data analysis that we did, that our analyst team did, and hopefully you find it helpful. We also have, and I want to make sure I leave time for questions, we also have some advice and guidance that for questions you might ask yourself around shifting from the potential to have a misalignment, which was the case that we saw here today, to having a clear North Star in how you show up in the marketplace. So, shifting from a misalignment of business strategy to ensuring your brand expression ladders directly to who you are is really important. Making sure brand leadership is involved in strategic decision making and having structure in place to guide and gain intelligence along the way is really important. And we're going to share this deck after so everybody has it as well. Informed market audience and insight is also critical. You can learn from your competitors. You can learn from brands in adjacent industries based on decision making that they did ahead of you making a decision. And having an always on insight engine for what's happening in and around your brand is really important. And then, of course, market landscape. What are white space opportunities? What are risks that we need to be aware of? That should be all a part of modern communication planning process. And then lastly, cultural intelligence is critical. The more you know of how your brand is perceived in culture, how people use your brand, whether it's through memes or through other expressions, is really important. And there's an underpinning as to how and what and why they feel what they feel for your brand. So that's really important too, as well. So I'm sorry if I rushed a little bit at the end, but I wanted to make sure we got to, if there were any questions that you might have for us. And I know that was a lot of information, and we're happy to talk to anybody offline as well. Just checking to see if there are any questions. I know there were a couple in advance. Kieran, this is were there communities or forums that accelerated backlash? Um, do you want to
Yeah,
take that one, Kieran?
yeah, happy to. Again, we pointed to some examples of these sort of external orbits of conversation around, top 100 influencers who quickly took up the mantle of issue, of critique, of frustration, of anger and outrage over a brand deigning to change its heritage from what was culturally anchored in Americana, and sort of trying to modernize, where the idea of modernization itself was a signal to the loss of some kind of American equity. And it really was these political spokespeople, the sort of influencers who were either taking signals from political leaders or influencing political leaders. We mentioned Robbie Starbuck. There are others of his ilk and of that particular forum who platform this kind of challenge. They are not necessarily brand enthusiasts, but they are definitely well followed. And when they make their comments known, they quickly create a high engagement and a high volume and velocity of spread. So it wasn't particularly one subset or a cultural set. It
Mhm.
was a group of people who believed that the issues Cracker Barrel was raising by virtue of change were issues deeply resident within a political schema versus one that was just purely about quick serve restaurants or branding.
Yeah, definitely. And I would just add that media, digital news reporters are paying attention to the conversation online. So they're looking for coverage opportunities from conversation that is emerging online. And that's what we saw with some of the earned coverage that triggered even more cross platform sharing of information related to this. And then this question, how can communications and marketing teams determine the difference between short-term outreach and long-term lasting sentiment shifts?
Yeah, I'm happy to cover this. And this is what I was trying to demonstrate with our risk monitoring tool that we're developing. The only way really to see what's going to sort of have residual impact or sustain or grow is by having the capability to do ongoing monitoring, risk escalation, triage, and mitigation. Part of that is how you plan before you do a launch or a change, but part of it is also having resources, analytics tools, and people like from Storyful who can keep a track of where your brand is basically being utilized, mentioned, or engaged with in those kinds of dialogues, and finding the context from multiple sources of reputation, risk, and online discourse, and identifying and triangulating key sources of risk and just how impactful that risk is in terms of its growth or its velocity or its volume, or how deeply engaged people tend to be with it, or looking at past exemplars of similar circumstances so that there can be an opportunity for the brand to respond quickly and accurately and broadly in those channels and spaces and places where those voices are starting to raise. So you can lower the tension, lower the volume and the temperature in the room, and maintain a sort of an ongoing stewardship of your brand and don't let it get out of your hand.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining, and we will follow up. And again, encourage to drop us a note or an email if you'd like to talk more. If you feel like your brand is facing an issue or you'd like to learn more, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we're happy to discuss more. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you. Bye now.